Is League of Legends a 5v5 game? Well, yeah, if I ask the question like that, answering with anything but a solid yes will get you a one-way ticket to the psych ward. Of course League is a 5v5 game. So, why do you play solo queue again? And no, I'm not going to make the tired argument that solo queue is for people who don't have friends. I do have friends, I promise. And no, they don't go away when I take my normal pills. It's actually a rather complicated thing, because most competitive team games, at least the ones that I've experienced, don't really have this divide between a solo queue and a team queue and separate ranks for each one. So I want to take the time to dissect why League is the way it is and whether or not this is a good thing. Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's divide League players into two categories: casual players and competitive players. Not competitive as in esports, but as in taking the game seriously and playing in order to become better at it. For casual players, there's normal games, both draft and blind pick, ARAM, and the rotating game modes like Arena, Earth, One for All, that kind of stuff. For competitive players, there are technically three playlists: Ranked Solo Duo, Ranked Flex, and Clash. But essentially, they're all the same thing really. It's all Summoner's Rift draft pick with a reward at the end. The only difference is the number of players that can be in a pre-made team. Solo Duo is as the name implies. You can only queue for this if you're either by yourself or you have one other person that you're queuing with. Flex is mostly for teams of 3 or 5 people. You can still queue alone or in a duo, just not as 4 people, for quite the nebulous reason actually. And Clash is the mode for games where it's one 5-man pre-made team against another 5-man pre-made team. If you explain these 3 modes to someone who's never played League before, they'll likely think that the most competitive mode is obviously Clash, right? It's the mode where you have to find yourself a full team to play, and the one where it's almost guaranteed you'll all be on voice comms against another team that's also doing the same thing. But in reality, it's the opposite. Solo queue is considered the most competitive, and the one that's taken more seriously. So how come a game that's designed around being a 5v5 team game has the solo mode as the main competitive experience around which most balance changes to champions and mechanics are made? Before talking about shoulds and shouldn'ts, let's first talk about why it is that way. Just from the top of my head, playing alone and getting a high rank with a positive win rate is one thing. Sure, you might have gotten lucky, people might say you're abusing whatever champion's meta or busted at the time, but at the end of the day, you did it by playing alone, by yourself. If you're playing in a team, then there's one more thing that might detract from your achievement, that you're getting carried by your team instead of climbing on your own merit. When going solo, you can't rely on your teammates for covering your weaknesses, because it's different people every time. You can't rely on a friend who's really good at macro decisions to make the calls for you, while you focus on something else. You have to do everything reasonably well by yourself. Compare that to a 5-stack, where each player has their own strengths and weaknesses, and instead of having to patch up the weaknesses, they can focus on their own strengths and improve teamwork instead. Better communication, better coordinated plays, better awareness of each other's playstyle. On the one hand, sure, you are climbing the ladder, but on the other, you're much more likely to let bad habits fester since they aren't losing you as many games as they would if you didn't have a team to rely on. Another reason why 5-stacking isn't considered as competitive is that as an individual player, you can improve faster by playing alone. Your jungle tracking, laning, and macro decisions will all skyrocket when you have to be aware of everything at once, instead of being fed that information for free by your teammates. This means that a solo player's overall game sense will likely be sharper than that of a player who only plays with a 5-stack, and they will likely be a better addition to the team because of that. Meanwhile, a team of players that consistently play together have another avenue to improve, which is to work better as a team. The longer you play together, the better you'll be at coordinating with each other and getting a feel for how your entire team will play, making the game a lot more predictable. In solo queue, you don't really have that stability, so you have to adapt to all that randomness and climb despite it. Okay, that would be a satisfying explanation, but there's one wee problem. Solo queue isn't really solo queue. It's solo and duo queue. Worst case scenario, you could have a team with a bot lane and a mid-jungle duo, and the enemy team is just 5 randoms. Honestly, I think that's even worse than having a team of 5 carry you against another team of 5. Riot did implement a solo-only queue for Master and above. You can't play as a duo after that unless you go for Flex queue or Clash. But even then, most Master players will still get Diamond players with high MMR in their lobbies, and those Diamond players can be in a duo, making the whole thing only really matter after Grandmaster or so. Now, this is only my humble opinion, but the closest thing we have to an ideal solution is to make every rank have the solo-only queue. Not just because of some nebulous concept like competitive integrity or solo 1v9 mentality that I don't really care about, but because it's just more fair for a solo player to have an environment where they'll go up against other solo players without having to deal with duos on either team. Then, if you want to play with a friend, Flex Queue would be the place to go. It has that problem of not having an MMR restriction for premates at all, but if it just worked like Solo Duo does now, where the whole team needs to be within a certain MMR margin of each other, then we'd effectively have a competitive queue for incomplete teams. This would also separate your skills as a player somewhat, where Solo Queue would indicate how good you are on your own in unpredictable games, and your Flex rank would be closer to measuring how well you can coordinate and work together as a team against other coordinated teams. There's also another benefit. If duos were moved to Flex Queue instead, that would massively decrease the queue times for it. Right now, if you're playing as a trio, it takes forever to find a flex match. Because of course, most solo and duo players will be queuing for solo duo queue. Solo only queue would push those duos to flex, and so you'd be able to find matches much more quickly when you have a trio. 4-man squads are currently restricted for queuing flex, but the main reason that Riot gives for it is that when this 4-man premade is losing, all the blame will most likely fall on the random solo player, whether they deserve the flag or not. Whether or not that's a concern big enough to warrant essentially banning 4-man groups from ranked queues altogether, I'll let you be the judge of that. Personally, I think it's a little stupid, it only makes queue times longer. As for the MMR restriction, what if you're Grandmaster and you want to play with your gold friend? Well, Normal Draft and Clash are there for you. It's not like you'd be getting a proper competitive experience with a skill disparity like that anyway. And when I say Clash, I only say it because of the tournament structure. Having one exceptionally good player on your team will only take you so far, because eventually you will run into teams with more than one good player in them. And so, while it may not be the fair competitive haven that solo queue would become, it would still be a better serious queue to play with friends than Normal Draft or, God forbid, ARAM. As for Clash, it should use some work, I think. Right now is that little notification that most people I know just ignore for the most part, when it's actually some of the most fun the game has to offer. It's not really advertised as a mainstay mode like Ranked is, and so it's relegated to being this side thing for a small niche of players. But tell me what you think in the comments. Would you be on board with a solo-only queue and making Flex actually work? Do you think the game is better solo or when playing as a team? And do you play Clash at all? Let me know in the comments. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you on the next one. Cheers!